Alright, time for another DraftScience video presentation. Anyway, so I'm going to play this Erwin Schrödinger clip. It's only 15 minutes, but it'll take longer to talk about it, I suppose. But anyway, it's not really physics. It is kind of the philosophy of science in some ways, and it is making some statements that are rather philosophical. Which is all interesting. And so anyway, back to so there hasn't been any, reasonable comments on the subject of kinetic energy, and so nothing to reply to. The V guy, I finally just blocked him because apparently he just wants to argue about arguing. He doesn't want to argue actual physics arguments. He just wants to argue about how you argue about physics arguments or something, and claims he doesn't want to talk about it anymore, but just keeps talking, So anyway, I helped him not talk about it anymore. So anyway, just letting you know why his comments may not appear anymore, because I'm done with it. Just a waste of time. Anyway, so as context to this Schrödinger thing, it's interesting because his name is so connected to quantum mechanics, but he had a lot of disagreement or contempt, even you could say, for the configuration of quantum mechanics by the time he was making this, which is 1954, I think. 49, yeah, it says right there, BBC 1949. And you can just see that the woo was already pretty much installed into the physics, and he was trying to uninstall it, and apparently didn't have any success, and in a sense didn't have any success because he's stuck with having the Schrödinger cat named after him, the thought experiment that's supposed to point out how ludicrous quantum mechanics is, and yet they're somehow using it as if it's this is a good theoretical foundation for explaining how things are in different states and the universe is many universes and all kinds of nonsense. And then he's also famous for an equation, and a wave equation that he also wouldn't have applied it the way they've applied it, in the sense that they've turned it into some sort of, it's a probability equation. It just states there's a probability. It doesn't state causes for the probability, but implied in his perspective is that you're supposed to use the equation in a circumstance that has variable circumstances. And the variable circumstances are what's creating the effect, the variable causes. So like the two-slit experiment, you have an obviously different circumstance between a photon that would travel through the center of the slit and the photon that travels next to the surface. So you have obvious variable circumstances that are the cause of the probability. So if I make the slit wider, the probability is it's more likely to hit the center. Gee, is that hard to figure out? No. And the narrower I make the slit, the more likely it is to be diverted, as if it flew next to something that affected it, like a surface. So it's that kind of thing. So he's sort of stuck with his name being attached to ideas that he didn't agree with at all. He, kind of overtly called such stuff, nonsense and ludicrous, and used some pretty strong language. So anyway, let's play the audio clip.
Electrons think.
So the question was, do electrons think? And obviously that on the surface is preposterous, but his point is that the way they're framing their understanding of the physical reality is they're sort of requiring there to be homunculus, a brain inside your brain, some little man inside your brain controlling your brain. And they're essentially going back to those kind of crude, silly mistakes of thinking the physical universe is being controlled by little magical particles that are capable of changing what happens. When, no, the whole giant thing has to make those kind of changes. Effects coming from the north and the south and the east and the west have to mix together to create change. You can't create change out of the little homunculus electron.
Electrons are charged particles the minutest we find in analyzing the ultimate constitution of matter.
Right. So, you know, the argument could be what matter's made out of are the two charges, plus and minus. So I would concede, if I was to say it, I would have said, you know, electrons, if electrons think, then protons have to too, because they're frankly the two actors in the play materially are electrons and protons, and the rain or the sunshine is the forces. You know, so you have the material bits, the players, and you have the thing that's causing them to either go outside or go inside. You know, the force.
To think that such a particle can think is so absurd that I might give the answer no and have my talk over. However, the idea has been launched not very long ago.
So he's sort of arguing that, you know, he wants to argue this because there's the implication that everything physics is doing now is becoming this statement almost. They're forcing physics into this form. Now, you know, I haven't seen what Schrödinger thought of, you know, he obviously was an ally of Einstein's at different points. But in some ways, the way he's describing some of the failures of the physics, I would argue that he could have made the same arguments against Einstein's bent space as a solution to a problem, because it really doesn't provide any mechanics, doesn't describe any underlying circumstance. It just makes a declaration of a law without a law causer. The cause is lost. What causes, you know, what exactly is the electron sensing, feeling? What's it interacting with that's causing it to move? And there's no explanation in bent space. Bent space gives you no insight beyond what Newton had already told you, which are the rules by which it moves. Didn't tell you why it moves, and neither did Einstein.
Not, of course, in this patently absurd form, but under a disguise.
So that's a key word here, because it's a key accusation that there's a lot of motivations of people being clearly influencing their statements and their support for ideas, and it all is very sneaky, just like Leibniz in a way. I mean, he wasn't sneaky about it in a sense, but he did overtly state his objections to Newton were based on religion. You know, his belief in a more complex underlying mechanism of God's control, and the free willer types in the 1700s that tried to reclamate Leibniz's theories weren't exactly secretive about their motivations either, but they were pretending they were doing science when clearly what they were doing is trying to justify a philosophical perception. They were trying to make the science fit their religion.
Of late, it has off and on met with quite honorable reception. Some intellectual hope has been set on it. I wish to plead here for the futility of this hope. To explain matters, I must go far back.
So he's going to give us some history, but, you know, the mistake, I think, could just be argued of allowing what we want to be true to cloud or influence what we can understand to be true, what the facts sort of say. And that would be I think that would have been a better course of action.
There's a very old dilemma in natural philosophy. Are our bodies and the bodies of the animals machines that act of necessity according to their material constitution and under the material influence of the environment, including the impressions on the sense organs?
So he uses the word automaton, but I don't know, maybe robot wasn't all that popular yet, but, you know, that's a simple statement. He's basically defending the idea that, yes, of course we're robots. Of course everything is being determined by things, by subtle causes and effects, and we can't do anything. We isn't a thing. that's controlling anything. We're byproduct. We're after all the little bits hits the mixing bowl and spins around. We're what flies out. Everything I just said is a byproduct of my education and the environment I was raised in, the language I was taught, and the behaviors I witnessed, and the how people express themselves. And if I was raised in some other society or culture, I would have a whole different kind of personality, and probably be talking all kinds of stupid shit, unfortunately. Damn, it sucks, I wouldn't be me.
This question, are we automatons, has about as often been answered emphatically in the positive as in the negative. It would lead us too far to follow up.
Yeah, so it's just a sad fact that even, with all this human progress, all this scientific progress, that people still have some hope that God lives in some form or other, whether it's a sparkly little, unicorn glitter, little sparkles of sparkly stuff, it's all, somehow it's made out of something better than insect parts.
All the arguments that came to the fore in the long history of the controversy. Strange compromises were suggested. Descartes, for instance, deemed us to be, on the whole, automatons, only the pineal gland, he said, was not.
So that was like Satan's gland or something. I mean, he was a religious, he was a Jesuit or something. But so he had to come up with some excuse for what seems like, some freeness, whatever that would be, some irregularity in our function, outside of what one expects from robots. And that nuance is just part of the complexity. There is no... It's just that we haven't heard all the songs, so we all think they're different songs, but they're really all the same song. It's all being made by the same song-making engine. It's just that it's able to throw in enough pixels to make images that look different. See, if it only has 4 pixels, then it's going to repeat itself pretty quickly, right? On, off, on, off, off, on, off, on. The pattern is recognizable. But if I make enough pixels, then just changing ons and offs, switching on and off, I can make, almost, I can make hundreds of thousands of different images, at least, maybe millions.
According to Descartes, it was this organ which controlled and directed all our spontaneous bodily movements. What is the present attitude of physiology to the question? We may take for it the word of its past master, Sir Charles Sherrington. According to Sherrington, there is no boundary between the animate and the inanimate. The same laws of physics and physical chemistry hold within the living body as outside.
Adamant and inanimate doesn't say much, right? Because obviously we know that everything's adamant, Brownian motion, so to speak. Everything has got pieces of it are obviously in tension and capable of vibrating, and you can put a noise in and 10,000 years later maybe pull the noise back out again. Everything's always it's easy to trap, even in objects that look static and immovable. There's stuff in it, okay, that we can't see.
The most careful investigation of the physiological processes in the nerves and in the brain reveals no leverage whereby mind could take direct influence on matter. Mind per se, that is, by its very...
Yes, that's why we have billions of brain cells, is because all of this has to be manufactured by billions of interactions. None of it's being directed by the pessimist electron or the optimist electron or the happy electron or the sad electron. There's no little underlying tiny mechanism thingy that's deciding. Now there's groups of it. If you have a bad liver, it can create a bad, hormones and give you a bad attitude. But that still requires a connection of events, a bunch of causes.
Nature cannot play the piano, mind per se cannot move a finger of a hand. This leaves us with the outlook that our body is as automatic or non-automatic as any inanimate piece of matter, any mechanical, chemical, electrical contrivance.
Right. So, but see, the comparison should be to a robot. We're not like a rubber band. I mean, we're more complicated than that. So we have programs that are built into us through our conditioning, through our maturation, and those themes, you could call them, our habits, have a lot to do with what we become. So my habit, okay, throughout most of my life, or all of it, frankly, my habit was I want to understand something, so I would poke at it. If there was an anthill in the yard, I'd kick it over to see how they built it. If there was an animal, I would poke it to see what it's going to do. I mean, a bug, whatever. I was curious as to its function. If something died, I'd bury it and dig it up again, see what happens, because I wanted to know how it works. And so that's a theme. And, so I'm just giving you that as an example of there's nothing I did. There was just this idea that brain, okay, said at some point there was some realization in my brain, just like I realized I can't walk through trees. I realized information has value. It's good to know what the thing is going to do or how it's going to do it. And so I wanted to know, how does it work so I can manipulate it better.
Only infinitely more complicated than even the most ingenious man-made machinery. The question is thus referred from the tribunal of physiology to that of physics and chemistry. But in the tribunal...
So you could argue now that some of these computers could exceed what we are in terms of complexity because they can store so much more memory, so they can have so much more memory capacity than what we can store, you could argue. So in some sense they've become more complicated, but we know that the rule governing how it uses all that memory are still narrow and not very sophisticated in terms of the functions are very, just like we're hungry, horny, this, that, these little group of things that keep us motivated, those are kind of simple. So the basic program running, the basic function of the machine is simple. Like a computer, you could knock it down to there's a part of the hardware that works on just organizing the pixels into the right position. And then there's another part of the hardware that's dealing with what information it can get off of, other peripheral devices. So there's different elements that are kind of dictating the overall function that are rather simple in number, but that takes millions of interactions to make the whole thing work.
To keep to the simile for a moment, there sits by the side of the judges a non-jurisprudent assessor, namely our own little self, which finds it distasteful to pass for an authority. Now,
right, and we find it distasteful because we're all raised in a conflict. We're raised by imbeciles who have kids. Okay, so first they're kind of stupid. They're kind of doty slaves to nature and slaves to being sloppy even. I mean, a lot of kids are born because the parents are just sloppy and they didn't do anything to stop it from happening. They weren't smart enough to even have a conversation like, well, you think we should have kids and how many should we have, and what? No, they just do stuff and let stuff happen. And so clearly when you're raised in a culture of people who are reckless and stupid, you're going to have stupid ideas. And so obviously a lot of those people that had kids in the past especially were religious people, and so they raise you with some sort of happily ever after bullshit, some sort of notion that who you become or what you become is somehow under your control somehow, like somehow you're not just a witness to your brain's function, that you're not just a witness to your personality, that you're not just a witness to whether you become smart and clever or whether you don't, and you're just a witness. You don't make yourself any of these things. It's you need the right program at the right time. You need the motivation at the right time to become something, and that's just a fact. And so you can be belligerently stupid. It's not your fault, but okay, it is sort of your fault if you're smart enough to know that being belligerently stupid isn't a good thing. Then you're being just a liar. You know, to walk around thinking you know what you're doing when, yeah, no, all you've tried to do is be belligerently stupid. You haven't you haven't done all the stuff necessary to be smart. You haven't really got any credentials. You're just talking big. You're not walking big.
So what does physics say to it? The situation is peculiar. From the earliest beginnings of physical science, we meet with a firm conviction that everything that happens is governed by inviolable laws, so that the course of events forms an inevitable and unalterable infinite sequence of causes and effects.
Yeah, it's it's one universe, and it's gonna do with billions and billions of years worth of processing, and it's billions and billions of years worth of events in a very huge giant place. So it's just impossible to even imagine all the events, and every single one of them was inevitable. You just can't evade any of them because they're all based on the fact that the little elemental bits really don't have any choices to make, and they really can't do anything but be a victim to what's in their way, where they've been pointed. The cannonball has to go where you shoot it, and it doesn't get to choose. I don't want to go there. I want to go somewhere. It doesn't get to do any of that crap.
The first atomic physicist was Euclid, a contemporary of Socrates in the 5th century BC. Of Euclid, only 2 sayings are preserved. One, that he refused to believe that sun, moon, and stars are living beings, and the other, which concerns us here, is that nothing comes to pass without a cause, but everything happens by reason and of necessity. This he maintained in...
So the first guy to say cause and effect, really. So, everything's caused. Something has to happen before something can happen. Yeah.
The 5th century BC, and towards the end of the 19th century AD, physicists were fully prepared to endorse his opinion. But now comes the peculiar thing. Twice, within 2,500 years, there was a...
Alright, so there's probably no point in him bringing up the twice, because he doesn't really explain the first time, which was just a few 100 years later from cause and effect guy. So he's talking about the creation of some religion, maybe. But who knows? He leaves that vacant, and then he's really talking about, the 1930 creation of quantum mechanics. And he says the word. I mean, he just says it with such a kind of a contempt, and it's just so ironic. He's so woven into quantum mechanics as if it's his theory, as if he's part of it, when he's clearly an outsider who's just being abused by it. Just as Einstein was. I mean, like somehow Einstein was for all of this woo, when he clearly wasn't.
Notable departure from the belief in the strict necessity of physical events. The first time this happened only about 150 years after Euclid. We gather this from the didactic poem of Lucretius, who was the posthumous mouthpiece of Epicurus, who lived in the 4th century BC. Their suggestion had no consequences. It was all but forgotten. The second time, the strictly course of...
So I don't know why he brought it up, right? It's all forgotten, blah, 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 so it's not even worth referencing because he didn't really reference it. But anyway, let's play again.
The linkage in the chain of physical happenings was thrown into doubt was only 30 years ago by Franz Exner in Vienna. About 10 years later, that is about 20 years ago from today, the disbelief in strict causation became part and parcel of what you might call the new creed now adopted by most physicists and called quantum mechanics.
So, pretty harsh statement against quantum mechanics, what it had become. And it had already become this, 20 years, 10 years anyway, 20 years before 49, so you're talking about 29, And clearly he saw the writing on the wall then, okay, that they're just turning this into a new religion.
Both times, the alleged breakdown of strict causality in the domain of physics was hailed for removing the obstacle in our understanding the spontaneity of the movements of the animals and of man. In understanding free will, as one usually calls it. Let us see whether this claim is justified. The hypothesis, as reported by Lucretius.
So it's nice that you brought up free will. Like I said, this is something that the German philosophers had sort of beaten the hell out of it in the the 1800s, and so Schrödinger was already. I mean, he was confident that he could talk about that. The whole, baby talk about free will. He's being very derogatory and dismissive. Without having to explain why, yes, of course, it's ludicrous. And so that's kind of revealed. And it is kind of ironic that now it's even harder to just point out to people there's no such thing as a free anything anyway. What do you mean free will? Like you don't have to practice. You don't have to do any of this stuff. It's all free. There's no free anything. Free isn't free is a white space word. It isn't a real thing. Free is the absence of a confinement. It's free. That's how. So you're not confined to being. Again, who wants a free will? What you want is an educated will, or a smart will, or a will that gets the right answers. You don't want a free to be an idiot.
It was very simple indeed. He just states that the atoms do swerve in a very small but entirely undetermined and unforeseeable way from the courses you would expect them to take from supposed strict physical laws.
So physical laws aren't really enough. You want physical causes. You want laws that are based on a cause. And again, Newton gave you a bunch of laws, but he didn't give you any causes. And they've used that fact, okay, the fact that it's still a place where you can play, in terms of inventing causes. And then Einstein shows up and invents one that's just plainly silly. It doesn't say anything. It just describes what the law does. The law says you go towards the center of the object. So that's what you do. You fall into the center of the object. I mean, there's no reasoning for why you would do that. What is the electron sensing? Again, what happens to an electron sitting in space? And I have a planet way over there, and it feels a little tug. What is it feeling? What is tugging on it? What's grabbing it and pulling it? Or what's banging into it and pushing it? And again, Einstein doesn't give you any answer at all. Completely nothing. It just happens. Huh?
No theory of the swerves is offered. This amounts to saying that the strict laws are only figments. The actual path of a particle is to a small extent arbitrary in the neighborhood of the fictitiously prescribed path. It is not illogical to surmise that the several little arbitrarinesses of the single atoms collaborate to bring about the apparent arbitrariness in the behavior of the animals and of man. What Lucretius forgets is that he has explained nothing. He has solved no problem. He has only referred the problem back to the ultimate particles, where it has become much more difficult to grapple with.
Right, so I would argue you could make the same statement about Einstein's theory. It doesn't answer any questions. It's just a poem, essentially. It's a redescription of the laws. It's not a statement about a cause.
The simplest spontaneous bodily movement, say the lifting of my arm, would require the planned collaboration of billions of single atoms in their undetermined swerves if they should bring about the integrated action. In modern physics, the denial...
So he's he's trying to make this simple, like he's just going through it, like he can't spend a whole bunch of time explaining the dynamics of a physical body, but he's basically just trying to explain that, my arm isn't going to spontaneously lift because all of those cells aren't going to just randomly decide to go up. So there has to be some other mechanism, but then that implies some master controlling electron. So he gets to that part. The parallel to somebody thinking that that there's somebody inside their brain, pulling the levers of their brain. No. The brain is its own lever. The levers are banging into each other, and that's what makes the byproduct of your brain's function. Is the lever moves and it hits another lever and hits another lever and hits another lever, and those levers all combine to create the outcome.
Of strict causation is of entirely different nature, in two respects. First, there is no question of only small departures from a fictitious exact law of motion. The behavior of primal particles, as electrons for instance, or of small atomic systems composed of only a few of them, is now supposed to be undetermined and unforeseeable within a wide margin of uncertainty. It is thought that in times we have to allow a particle the choice between several entirely different courses to take.
So the irony is that his wave equation is accepting the law and the fact that the outcome is probabilistic, but it's only probabilistic because you have a circumstance that allows there to be different outcomes because it has variables in it, like slits. So if you don't have variables, then you don't have multiple choices in terms of the cause and effect. And it's only the variables that are causing the effect. And so he's clearly on the hidden variable theory, clearly pointing out that the answer is in the variables. The answer isn't in the fact that the electron itself is variable.
Let this for the moment be figurative speech, meaning only that nothing in the observed situation determines the course the particle actually takes. But on the other hand, the situation is supposed to determine with rigorous precision the statistics of the various possible choices. Given the same situation over and over again, the particle will, for instance, in exactly 2/3 of the cases follow one course, in 1/3 of the cases the other one. And similarly when there are more than two courses to follow. Again.
So he doesn't really say it the way the courses are built into the environment. The courses aren't built into the electron. And clearly the probabilities are real, but their probabilities aren't innate. And so this is like, again, it'd be nice to contrast this against Feynman, who's making exactly the opposite argument, that somehow the universe does play dice, that somehow there is some dice thrower, that somehow whatever the electron is, something obliges it to do wacky stuff for no reason, to react differently in the same environment. And it can't, there's no reason to defend that physics because there's no evidence of that physics.
The same as 2,000 years ago, it has been suggested that this breach of strict causation leaves room for the display of the spontaneous movements in the animals and in man. Is this claim now justified? I think not. There are grave objections from physics, from physiology, and from philosophy. From physics. If the individual, or its mind, or whatnot, could make free use of the choice left to the single electrons, this would infringe the statistical laws when a synoptic view of many similar cases is taken. This is as bad or as good as a breach of strictly causal laws. If we suspend physics in the living body, we can explain anything. I'll put this point briefly and drastically. It could be clinched in all detail.
Right, so again, he's just saying, I probably need to say more, but I really don't have time, so you're stuck with what I just said, which is there's an implications that are paradoxical and nonsensical to master electrons. It doesn't work. It doesn't rise to the surface, efficiently to create behaviors.
To explain the physiological objection, let me observe that physics strictly disallows a mutual dependence of the choices taken by various electrons unless they are close neighbors. One would therefore have to assume, and this has been proposed, a master cell and...
Right, so this is getting to the second argument, which I would call is the environmental argument, where you can see so often the variables that are affecting what you do on a particular day, the events. You twist your ankle going down the stairs and it changes your day. Little physical things happen. It rains, or the sun's out, or it's too hot, or you step in dog dew, or whatever. Some stupid thing happens, and it changes the course that you were on. Okay, and so we're clearly being controlled more by the environment outside than the inside, and then the inside environment is also being controlled by the outside environment. And in a sense, the outside environment twisted your ankle, but now your twisted ankle causes you pain, and now you have this irritating pain that's making you irritable. And so now when your neighbor complains about something, you punch him in the face and you end up in court and blah 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 blah, and none of it had anything to do with what your electrons were doing. It had everything to do with what's carrying your electrons and what happened to the thing carrying them. They got jostled and the eggs broke. It's the eggs just don't explode.
Within it a master molecule, and here the choice on the atomic scale would take place and would determine a spontaneous movement of the whole body. This is flatly contradicted by what we know about the functioning of the brain. The number of brain cells cooperating in such a case is enormous, and the idea that they should always be set at work by one master cell, even if it were not to be always the same one, is ludicrous.
Yeah, there'd be no point in the knee-jerk being this complicated. We would just be a very simple organism. We wouldn't need 100 billion neurons if the action was as direct as some decision made and then just, making the decision happen. Clearly, making the decision is what the brain's mostly doing, and it makes the decision by the same cause and effect rules that a bunch of different elements of your function are arguing with each other. They're throwing stuff into the bowl and they're trying to make their thing stick, so to speak. I mean, it's a bunch of like a DNA molecule. It's a bunch of competing memes and ideas, and the strength and how they're rewarded and punished, and what hormones and what little bits of chemistry are attached to them. This stream of programming, and programs are basically just fighting with each other like a I metaphored it years ago to like the seven dwarfs. You're made up of different little personalities, different little ideas like honor and integrity, and then you have the selfish little bits, like sleepy and horny, and and all of them are arguing about what the organism is going to do. Do we go to work today? Lazy and sleepy and tired and irritable, and I'm sick of this. All of those dwarves are voting no, and then the ones that are saying do your duty and be an honorable person and be respectable and earn what you say and don't be a hypocrite. All of those are arguing the opposite, and you end up just byproduct of that vote, that democracy of the elves punching each other in the face and the nuts. And something wins because of, frankly, how you've been, what ideas have your brain. All the dwarves have said, well, as much as I don't like what he votes for sometimes, he's a good guy, so keep his voice. And so it's a democracy of sorts by all of these little things fighting. And so you can't have your integrity if you know you're lying. You can't have this if so there's elements that are stopping you from being controlled by being your selfishness or your personal gratification. So we have this mixture that ends up being a human personality that basically is run by culture in a lot of ways. This subject comes up, but I mean, there's cultures where they eat dogs or cats, and it just seems so like you have to be insensibly brutal. They make arguments like they'll disembody the organism, but still cut its arms and cut its legs off, and before they kill it, because they think it makes it taste better. I mean, things that are just so illogical, so brutally stupid. And you're saying how do they function? How can they do anything right if they can't get that right? That ain't a nice thing to do. What the fuck are you doing that for, you crazy kook? It is amazing dysfunction, and it's just because somewhere in their brain there's not a connection between any notion that this has something to do with their welfare as well. That they certainly wouldn't want to be treated like that by the aliens. They'd want the aliens to be smart enough to know that's not a nice thing to do.
But assume you could override even this objection. There might be a delicate system of relay action which we may have hitherto failed to discover. Then I am left to believe that a single electron, or very few of them, by making use of the free choice the primitive laws of physics leave them, should enact a movement of my body. However, this movement is sometimes preceded by a long deliberation, a careful and maybe painful weighing of motives. This ultimately disposes, let me say, my mouth to open and to pronounce the name of a person I hesitated to give away. It is not only obvious, but actually indubitable, that the preliminary deliberations involve extended parts of the brain, billions and billions of cells.
All right, so he's just pointing out, come on, don't be silly. We have a big brain because it's doing a lot of work. It's not there for no reason. It's making the decisions. Nothing elemental is making a decision.
To assume that this activity eventually determines the decision in the supposed master group of electrons would entirely spoil the game. For the point was that their behavior was to be exempt from physical causation. If you want to keep this up, you needs must be prepared to let all the thinking and weighing of motives be done by the one master group of electrons alone, and with...
So the real key is that this is a Rube Goldberg thing. You can initiate it with a single electron, but the single electron isn't going to be initiated by choicing. It's going to be initiated by just accident, right? So it's almost built into the Schrödinger cat thought experiment. What's the first cause? There's, that's what you're really arguing. Well, of course there isn't a first cause. I mean, there's just the fact that you have something that initiates the action. So, and even then, talking about radioactive decay, I'm sure Schrödinger would say it doesn't just spontaneously happen. There's a cause, there's a reasoning, a circumstance in which atoms exist that causes them to decay. There are rules. We just don't know those rules yet. We haven't discovered the laws governing radioactive decay, but they're going to be the same kind of laws that govern gravity. That the matter has to be here, and this piece of matter has to be here for the piece of matter to turn this way. There has to be a circumstance, and the circumstance is going to decide decay. It's not going to just spontaneously happen.
Without any accompanying physical process. This is absurd.
So, it's a good word. I like it. Absurd. So, yeah, there's a lot of absurdity in what's going on this planet. Lots of absurdity. So, anyway, I just thought that was, personally, I found that very interesting. Because, you hear a lot about Schrödinger. It was interesting to hear him actually speaking. And, parts of it were surprising. I didn't, his voice is a little thin. But he is, he speaks very carefully, and clearly he speaks really good English. So, That part was interesting. You know, so not much to say. It says Austrian physicist. So yeah, I always kind of just associate him with German, but you know, back in the 30s, that's, you know, you could mix up the two. But anyway, so yeah, that's enough, I guess. So food for thought, blah blah blah. Context, you know, would be so interesting if we could drag some of these guys back into being here again. You know, if we could just set up the program, the Schrödinger program and the Einstein, and just, you know, it'd be just because, you know, we have learned a lot since, you know, them, and you know, some of these questions, you know, there are better answers, and you know, because we've had more time to think about it. But that's part of the problem, right? Is people don't like thinking about it. They gave up on the whole idea of energy, you know, and they once they put it in writing, their F equals ma and their silly, you know, perversion of the equation into a monstrosity, they're committed to it, and they just sit on that pile of mush and say, we've already solved this answer, we've already solved this problem. And then they did that to the slit experiments with their silly, you know, God does play dice with the universe ideas, and their, you know, wave mechanics. I mean, the irony is they have a theory that's a combination of these things that Feynman didn't even agree with. You know, waves don't really have anything to do with it. It's the idea that the electrons or photons are randomized by the process. They don't do the same thing in the same condition. Create the same universe and the same outcome doesn't happen. Put them in the same place in front of two slits and somehow a different outcome happens. Well, not if you put them in the same place, I would argue, because then you're going to guarantee it goes right through the center or it goes by one of those surfaces. Yeah, it's just so clear that the surfaces are causing the effect. And it's amazing that physics is sticking to an explanation that doesn't even acknowledge the existence of the obvious variable, the surfaces. It's an obvious variable, and they're pretending it doesn't exist. All right, anyway. So, maybe it wasn't to your taste, but a little bit different kind of video, but whatever. I found it interesting. And such. So, call it a video. And such. I'll hit this one. This has been a DraftScience video presentation and such. And yeah, so till the next time. Yeah.